There we go. I'm honored and delighted to be here. This is a really terrific conference on terrific topics. I will start by saying that I also had a very scary experience coming from the airport in a taxi that was repeatedly coming up within a foot of the car in front of them and trying to run them off the road. And when I asked them if I told them I wasn't in a hurry, he had me translate with his iPhone leaning over to the back seat. So I was, and then he made me stop at an ATM to get cash because he wouldn't take my credit card. So I was missing my Uber very much. I need consumer protection. Okay. So I want to talk today about the internet and the news media and really focus on the role of the aggregators and intermediaries that come between the users and the news and between the advertisers and the readers. And so, we've always had an important role of platforms and intermediaries that affect consumer choice. But when we look back to, say, the browser wars of the 1990s or the issues around Microsoft Windows, where we were very worried about, Microsoft advantaging their own media player, it feels very quaint. Because, at that time, there was a fairly small amount of economic activity impacted by that. The browser, of course, turned out to be more important, but also have dynamics over time. But, when we think now about the mobile phones, they're really getting between us and everything that we do, our payments, finding a coffee shop, and so on. And so, of course, news is one of the more important things for our democracies, and that's what we're going to study today. But I just want to emphasize that I think the roles of platforms and intermediaries are just going to increase in importance over the next 10 years. And they really have a lot of power. And the smaller your device, the more power they have, and I'll show you some evidence about that. So today I'm going to talk about a series of papers I've been working on with various co-authors. I'm going to start out with a paper with Emilio Cavano and Joshua Gans, and then move into some empirical work I've been doing to try to study the impact of these things. So just to start with, on the theory side, I want to think about what's the role of the changes in consumer behavior on advertising markets. So, when we look at the news media, we all know all the terrible facts, the fall in advertising revenue, unbundling of classifieds, web ad revenue is low. Can't possibly cover all of these topics, but we're very today, but we're seeing a really massive change in this industry, which is incredibly important for our democracies and for non-democracies, for that matter. So this is the chart of doom. This is newspaper ad revenue in 1980 dollars. It falls off a cliff. You can decompose it. It's not just circulation. It's not just classifieds. It's just a very bad story. So to think about trying to understand what happens, we're going to focus in on the role of advertising markets and advertising prices. And our paper focuses on two main facts. First of all, the internet facilitates consumer switching between outlets, and I'm going to provide a lot of empirical evidence later to show you exactly how consumer behavior is affected, particularly by search engines and by aggregators and social media. So what we see broadly is that all of those things really decrease consumer loyalty and distribute them among a much larger number of outlets. So they really increase consumer multi-homing across outlets. And second, despite all of the worry about targeting and cookies and people spying on you, it's still the case that actually advertising platforms do a pretty crappy job of following you around. They cannot reliably tell whether you've seen an ad or not. They can do it probabilistically, but it has quite a bit of mistakes. ComScore is one company that's done a lot of work on reach and frequency. So they have kind of spyware on a bunch of computers of people who've opted into their panel, and they look at everything the consumers see, so they can actually see how many times a consumer sees an ad. So they worked with 30 large advertisers and tried to measure, when they did major campaigns, were they actually achieving the reach and frequency goals they wanted to? So reach means how many consumers you get, frequency is how many times you hit them. So they provided me some data on this topic, And what they showed was that a big chunk of impressions, say over half of impressions, were what is considered by the advertising industry as wasted. They say if you hit somebody only once or twice, you don't remember. If you hit them, 10 or more times, it's just excessive and doesn't have any extra benefit. So most of the impressions were not in the sweet spot. And presumably that's because we're seeing consumers move across outlets, and the ways that advertisers are trying to control that are not working. And these were advertisers were already using the most sophisticated tools at the time. So, traditional media economics, which actually isn't all that old, but it has a sort of stylized model from Anderson Coate. And the idea is that, sort of in the old world, we had consumers would sort of read one newspaper. The newspaper business was a platform matching advertisers and consumers. And so if you were, say, a national advertiser and you wanted to hit everybody once, you could just go to all the newspapers, and most people were reading only one newspaper, and so you'd hit everybody once. And given that everybody was only going to one newspaper, as an advertiser, you would multi-home. If you want to get all the people in New York and Boston and Washington, you could advertise in those 3 markets, and you'd get everybody one time. So the single homing by the consumer leads to multi-homing by the advertisers. So what does that do to prices? Well, basically, each newspaper has monopoly access to their users. So they hire reporters and they make investments to attract the consumers. Once they have the consumers, they auction them off to the advertisers to the highest bidder. Okay? So we used to have a lot of antitrust concerns about newspapers and newspaper mergers and so on. Exactly, these guys were really quite profitable not so long ago, and they were basically charging monopoly prices to the local advertisers. They had some competition, but for a certain type of advertising, they had a lot of power. So, when our new model tries to get at what happens when we see actually consumers flitting around lots of outlets. But of course, most of the prior theory literature had either focused on the case where the consumers did one thing or the consumers did everything. But this is a world in between, where you don't know exactly which outlets the consumers will go to today. So it's sort of imperfect switching, partial switching. And so then the question is, well, what happens to the advertisers and what happens to the prices? And so we're going to try to endogenize the multi-homing decisions of the advertisers and see what happens to advertising prices. So just to think about this from the perspective of an advertiser, the advertiser may be trying to reach a consumer. They might go to one outlet in the morning and see a Starbucks ad, come back to that outlet in the afternoon and see a Zipcar ad. Okay, but of course that consumer might actually switch outlets and go to a second outlet, and if things work well, they'll see a different ad. But that outlet might not know that the consumer had already seen the Starbucks ad, so they may also just see the Starbucks ad again. And so then Starbucks has a choice. If they single home and only go to outlet 1, they might actually, miss the consumer. But if they multi-home, they might waste impressions. So in some sense, the consumer switching is going to lead to a lower quality product bought by the advertiser, because the advertiser is not getting 1-for-1 an additional new consumer for every ad it buys. Okay, so the switching basically lowers the quality of the product. So we build a model around this, and I'll just summarize some of the main results. So first of all, just as a benchmark, if we actually could track the consumers around the web, and the only thing that was changing was the consumers were going to lots of different outlets. That might happen, for example, if you had a single monopoly ad platform that tracked everything. Okay, that ad platform, of course, might charge high margins, but that's another story. If you had perfect tracking, then the switching would just lead to competition among the advertising outlets for the users. And so you would have lower advertising prices just from a competitive perspective. On the other hand, if we have imperfect tracking, and we think this is really what's interesting, it really changes the structure of competition in the advertising markets. And in particular, it leads to endogenous mixed homing. That is, we're going to see some advertisers are going to go to multiple outlets and some are going to go to only a single outlet. And of course, this is what we see in reality. We're going to see high-value advertisers paying high prices to get reach. So they want to, if I want to make sure everybody in the country sees my ad, I'm going to pay high advertising prices for that and hit everything. At those equilibrium prices, a low-value advertiser is going to say, gosh, that's too expensive. That price is too high, given that I know I only get, half a new consumer for every ad. That price is too high for half a consumer. But if I single home and just go to one major outlet, okay, then I'm going to get one consumer for one ad. So I'm going to get a higher quality product because I'm going to count on that outlet at least to know how many times the consumer has seen the ad. So they're going to say, well, that price is fine for me if I go to just one outlet. That price is too high for me to go to multiple outlets, because when I go to multiple outlets, I get a lower quality product. I get less users per ad. So as a result, the low-value advertisers single home and miss out on some users. And we can think of this as sort of from the advertising market perspective, it's a reduction in demand. We're going to have some people sort of out of the market who efficiently might be in the market in the tracking thing. That's going to lead to lower advertising prices. It's also going to lead to interesting industry dynamics where being big is going to have some advantages. If you're big and people are only going to go one place, they're going to want to come to you to get a lot of consumers. And so we're going to see pressures towards consolidation or a pressure towards using advertising platforms, which themselves are going to have scale economies and market power. So just to think about some of the applications to various industry questions, we can think about blogs. What do blogs do? Well, if blogs steal your readers as a newspaper, you're unhappy. But blogs, if they don't have a lot of ads, they're actually going to take up scarce user time without adding supply to the advertising market. So that may not be so bad as you might think. Aggregators also today don't put up a lot of ads on their homepages generally. So that could be good, but they're going to really increase switching of consumers. And that switching by consumers is what makes it so hard for the outlets to monetize for a whole variety of reasons, in addition to the ones that in our model. You're also going to see returns to having high reach. So, we might have thought a few years ago that what Facebook was going to sell was social network data. That's not what Facebook sells to advertisers. What Facebook sells to advertisers is reach. They say, we are the only platform on the planet where I can make sure I hit every US user exactly twice next week. That's what they sell, and they command a higher price for that. Finally, when we think about paywalls, they really are going to have some effects beyond sort of the obvious effects. The obvious effects are if you put up a paywall, you're going to get less consumers. But the fact that being small is a disadvantage in the advertising market is an additional effect. If you're small, people aren't going to come to you if they single home. They're going to want to go to bigger outlets for single homing, and so they're going to get an additional disadvantage in terms of prices. Okay, so that's what I have to say today about the advertising market. Obviously, this is a really interesting area, and there's lots of research that can be done to really unpack all of the different effects. But the basic, the basic idea here is that this increased switching and lack of consumer loyalty can have pretty strong effects in the advertising market. The next thing I want to do, I just want to report briefly on an experiment that I did on the effect of position in search. And so here I want to try to back up a little bit the claim I made at the beginning that aggregators are really important. Anybody who runs a website understands this, okay? Anybody who runs a website knows that if you change the order of what's on the page, if you change the font, if you make something more prominent, you are going to change where people go. For eBay, the rankings in which they put up their products is one of the most important things that they do. They've had some of the biggest innovations and investments they've made in the past 10 years have been around their search and their search ranking. The order in which you put things is really important. So this can be seen very clearly in a randomized experiment I did on internet search. So I took a few million Bing users in the United States, and what I did is I tried to understand what is the causal effect of position. And just to think about the context of why everybody knows that position is important, but we want to see how important it is. And somebody like the European Commission might ask, well, gosh, I took when I took economics, we thought about search cost as walking down the street. I got that. How can it really be that important if you're in position 1 or position 3 on the page? It's all on a page. Doesn't that look like zero search costs from a free market economics? But if you understand the internet, if you understand websites, that's completely wrong. So we need to measure that, though, so they could understand what is the impact if, say, Google takes Google Finance and pins it to the top, like they admitted in their depositions to the FTC that were publicized recently on the web? They said, oh, we admit that we actually pin our own products to the top and demote products that are higher quality. What is the actual impact of that on outcomes? So this data here shows the dark blue is the natural click-through rate of algorithmic results. And so the first position gets, 25% of clicks, the second position about 7, the fifth position about 4, the 10th position about 2. So that shows just when you look at the page how do clicks fall off as you go down the page. But of course we know that Bing and Google work really hard to put the best thing in the top position. So comparing 25% to 7% does not give you the causal effect of taking something and putting it in the third position. To get the causal effect, we want to run a randomized experiment where we actually take the thing in the first position and put it in the third position. So the sum of the dark blue and the light blue is what happens when you take the thing in the first position and put it in the third, fifth, or 10th position. So we see if you take the thing in the first position and put it in the third position, it's going to get roughly 12% click-through rate, while it got 25% in the first position. So just taking something from the first to the third position, you lose over half your traffic. That's the causal effect. The quality effect is that 5%, the fact that this thing gets more clicks than the thing that was normally in the third position. That's the effect of the fact that the thing in the top position was a better result. That's why you put it there. Now, I should say that we took out some things in this study. For example, if somebody was typing in eBay and trying to get to eBay, that's not in the sample. We basically couldn't get the company, first of all, to do that kind of experiment. It makes the user so unhappy. But second of all, generally that type of switch on a navigational query is something that would be so unpleasant for the users that we probably wouldn't contemplate doing it. Okay, so now that we understand how powerful these intermediaries are, they can really determine what you click on. Let's now think about exactly what impact news aggregators have on consumer behavior. So just to start with, we've had a number of regulatory hearings. There was one that I presented at in particular that was very colorful, one of the funnest conferences I've been to. We had Rupert Murdoch and Arianna Huffington facing off, okay? So Rupert Murdoch says, he makes some actually fairly cogent economic arguments. He says that, aggregators are stealing our content. He says that, well, if we don't make any money from the content, we're not going to produce it. So in Huffington's speech, she actually did a nice job for us. She went through all of Rupert Murdoch's previous speeches and came up with a summary of things that Rupert Murdoch says about aggregators. Rupert Murdoch calls them parasites, content kleptomaniacs, vampires, and tech tapeworms on the intestines of the internet. Now, I actually like that one in particular as an economist because it actually captures, the real phenomenon he's worried about. Tapeworm is a parasite. Somebody else does the work, and the tapeworm sucks the life out of it, okay? So this is actually the economic phenomenon we're worried about, that someone else is going to benefit from your investment in intellectual property. And so that's the concern. And he says, well, you should opt out of our aggregators if you have a powerful brand. At this talk also, Josh Cohen from Google says, well, hey, Google's all about helping you find stuff. We're helping you find things on the internet. And he says it's very, very simple for a news website to opt out of Google News if they want to. Now, that last comment is obviously pretty disingenuous because if you don't have differentiated content, Google News is in the whole business of making the content pretty undifferentiated. It shows you articles, not outlets. And so if one outlet goes away, that your consumers will just go to another outlet. And so opting out isn't really a solution for an individual publisher. Only a collection of publishers would actually have an impact on getting people not to go to Google News and come to their websites. But the idea that Google helps you find stuff is a very plausible argument. And me as a consumer, I like aggregators. They do help me find stuff. Okay, and Arianna Huffington just says, hey, look, we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. All right, so just summing that up, aggregators can substitute for the homepage of the internet. Only about half of page views on Google News result in a click-through. So a lot of people are using Google News as a substitute for, say, the New York Times homepage or another homepage. So it's a substitute. On the other hand, if it really helps you find stuff, it could be a complement. It could make you read more news. So we're going to measure that. Another thing, though, is it can really change the composition of news consumption. Because an aggregator reduces search costs, it's going to show you content from lots of sites. Sites where for you as a user, the search cost of going to that site, remembering the URL, bookmarking it are too high. These are small niche sites. It's just not worth it for you to go there in expectation they don't have anything interesting for you. But Google News is going to organize it for you, and so if it does it nicely, then maybe you're going to find something and go somewhere you wouldn't have gone before. So it's going to make you more fickle, but perhaps help you discover things. It's going to decrease, it's going to take you directly to articles and bypass the homepage, which is also going to decrease the curation role of news outlets. Okay? And you might think that's good if you think computers are better at curation than editors. You might think that's bad if you think that editors shove some news about Syria down your throat, but that actually keeps you informed about, which is helpful for your democracy. Okay. So the empirical approach, we're going to look at natural experiments. We have two natural experiments. One is the shutdown of Google News in Spain in December 2014. And the second is the introduction of Google Local in France in 2009. In each case, I've got data from the PC. I unfortunately do not have mobile. And I'm going to be using this PC data to see what happens to individual users over time. I should highlight that my data from Google News is preliminary, and that's basically because when you work with browsing data, internet browsing data, there's a lot of messy details in determining who referred something to whom, and we've mostly cleaned that up, but this just happened, and so it's not completely clean yet. Our results are still changing a little bit quantitatively from week to week, and we've also just been adding more data as well as the time goes on. So we're going to look at approximately 200,000 PC internet users in Spain who went online at least 21 of 23 weeks in our sample, which includes the week of change, 10 weeks before Google News Spain shut down, and 12 weeks after. And we're going to ask how news consumption changed, which outlets gained, and what the implications of aggregators are for industry structure. So this is the chart of overall news viewing by these users in Spain before and after the shutdown. So we've got Crown Princess Christina being indicted. That shows you just how much internet news can change. You also see how volatile internet news is just by day of week and so on. So actually, right after this happened, some people said, in the first few weeks, they said, oh my gosh, the Google News shutdown is really killing news consumption. You can see this downward trend. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that what's happening here December 25th, this is Christmas. So people just don't read the news very much around Christmas time, and this creates a big challenge for us empirically to try to understand what's going on. When we look at, we look also for all users, when we look at the referral source shares, we're going to see that we may not expect to see a lot of impact of Google News. Why? Well, this green bar here is the share of referrals that are coming from Google News. It goes to 0, but it was pretty small to start with. So against the backdrop of all of this noise, how are we expecting to detect an effect that's, pretty small? So in order to deal with these challenges, what we do is we actually we focus in on a smaller subset of users. We focus in on users who were regular Google News users before the shutdown. And we match them up with users who were otherwise identical before the shutdown. How much they went online, how much news they read. And so for every user that used Google News, we find a matched control guy who looked similar for all the weeks before. So you can see we do a pretty good job matching. The Google News users are red, the control users are blue. We match them up really nicely up until the Google News shutdown. Then after Google News shuts down, we see a decline in news viewing for all of the Google News users. Okay? So we see that's about 11.4% reduction in news page views. That includes landing pages. And if you count the articles that people see but don't count the landing pages, there's a 16% reduction in article views by those users. Okay, so then we can try to understand, there's sort of two things. One is they read less news. The second question is, how do they get their news? What are the referral sources for this news? So this is just the Google News users now. And we see for them, they were actually relying pretty heavily on Google News. They were relying on Google News about as much as Google Search, and just a bit less in direct navigation. When Google News goes away, they start directly navigating to news websites more, and they also start using Google Search more. And so this is already showing a bit of this idea that Google News competes with the top outlets. If you want to see what's going on, you can go to the Google News homepage, or you can go to a top outlet web page. And so when Google News goes away, you use the top outlets more. So we do these difference in difference estimates, where we look at the trends over, remember we had this overall time trend, so we have the control users and we look at their changes over time, and we compare them to the Google News users and their changes over time. And so we can first look at, for the Google News users, the quantitative impact on how many outlets they go to, how many sessions they do, how many page views they do, and how many distinct real news articles they read. And we see decreases in that across the board. We can then say, well, what happens to their direct navigation? And we see actually big increases in percentage increases in these guys' direct navigation, as well as getting to outlets from search. And so that's kind of quantifying what I showed you in the graphs before. Now we can look at top outlets. So here I'm going to focus on the top 5 Spanish outlets and see what happens to the top 5 outlets. And so here we're going to see that there's going to be a reduction in the number of distinct outlets they go to. And so again, Google News is sending you to more outlets, and we also saw that sort of for all outlets as well as for top outlets. But we're going to see that we're going to do more reading overall, including the home pages of the top 5 outlets. So the top 5 outlets actually benefit from the Google News shutdown. So just to conclude on Spain, overall Google News is too small to have an aggregate impact. Google Search is much more important. And you can see that in the numbers. On a PC, Google Search is still a very important way that people get their news. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but what happened in Italy was there was a time when they took Google News out of search, and that's very impactful. Google News itself is still a pretty small product. But it's going to, if we think about this as evidence about the overall impact of aggregators, we see here already that aggregators are sort of bad for big outlets and good for small outlets. And so I would just want to think about more research is probably required to really understand the welfare effects of that. If we think small outlets are mostly copying stuff and don't produce original content, then we wish the big outlets would get more readers because they're the ones who do the work and the investment. They send reporters to Syria. We want them to make more money to fund the reporters to Syria. If we think some of the small outlets are providing media diversity and they're niche and they're really providing interesting stuff, then we might think that it's good that Google News and other things actually send people there in order to allow really innovative small content to be discovered. My guess is that a lot of what's happening is the first thing, that is that most of the investment is coming from top outlets, but we don't want to completely neglect the second thing. So now let me briefly talk about Google Local. This was an interesting one because there was actually a whole block of content that didn't used to come on Google News that came onto Google News. So if you want to think about the counterfactual, if a group of newspapers comes and says, we want to have antitrust exemption to collude to take ourselves out of an aggregator, this is a good natural experiment for understanding what the effects would be. So before November 2009, you could input topics. After 2009, you could put in your location. Eventually, of course, Google and all the rest figure that out from your IP address. But for a period of time, you had to put this in. And so if you put in your location, then a big chunk of the web page was going to see prominent local content, say content from Paris. So we have a different kind of experiment here, though. Different users are going to get this at different times. So that's helpful, because we had the Christmas effect, which was kind of screwing up Spain, and all of my numbers have big trends in my Spain stuff, so I'm sort of sensitive to how I deal with trends. For Google Local, it's going to be different dates for different people. So when I find a control user for a treatment user, I'm going to find a control user who looks the same at the same point in time, and I'm going to assign the control user sort of an artificial treatment date, which is equal to the date that the treatment user, the Google News user, adopted Google News. So I can just show you a picture here. So we're going to leave out the date of adoption. Here, the blue are going to be the users that adopted Google Local. The control are going to be the matched users who looked similar on the same dates as the Google News users. And so we're going to have 0 now instead of a calendar date. That's the day relative to sign up. And so, of course, on the day of sign up, we know that all the Google News users were online and on Google News. So there's a big spike there, which we omit from the analysis. And then what we study is this gap right here, this gap between the treatment and control. So what we find here is that bringing in all of this local content to Google News made the Google News webpage much more attractive, which is sort of what the newspapers are saying, like, hey, we make this content, and without this content, nobody would like your webpage. And so here, without the local content, people didn't like Google News as much as when Google News had a whole nother block of content. So getting that content, of course, is crucial for the quality of the Google News and the Google News experience. But what's interesting is that we did find that more people went to local news websites as a result. And this is sort of the search cost argument. Even though half of people don't click through on Google News, a lot of these people just weren't ever bothering to go to a local page, because really what's happening locally that's that important to me? It's just not worth my time to go to a local site. But if Google News shows me, maybe I'll find something that's actually interesting to me. And then maybe I'll continue to follow that story on the local media. We actually see that the non-local news consumption is also lifted by the Google News homepage consumption. We see the increased dispersion in browsing patterns, so the increased switching that we talked about at the beginning, as well as a reduced user reliance on the news outlets' index pages. So again, the curation role of the newspapers declines. So just to conclude, I'm going to say, aggregators and intermediaries play a really important role. Ranking is really powerful. You thought you were making your own choices, but the websites are making so many choices for you across all of them. They're puppeteers and you're the puppets. They really affect your decisions. Changes in search costs have a very large effect on user behavior. They can affect advertising markets, they can increase news consumption, but they're also going to compete with large outlets and really redistribute users to smaller and more niche outlets. Finally, I'll mention that we've got some ongoing work on the effect of social media, Facebook and Twitter and so on. We also find that they redistribute users to small outlets. They also take readers to different kinds of content, to more biased content, more opinionated content, more positive content, more emotional content. And we find that people who like to read polarized news actually really read a lot of polarized news from Facebook and Twitter. In the end, even Fox News, a very conservative newspaper, has a lot of unbiased news. And so, but your friends and the things they think are cool to share and that you click on Facebook actually are more biased. And so that curation role of the traditional outlets is getting replaced by something that's not necessarily rewarding neutrality, that's not necessarily rewarding investment. And so that's something I think we all need to be concerned about as a society. And finally, I'll just emphasize again, Google News is interesting. We can study it because it made changes, but it's small. Search is big. And that's really where a lot of the action is. If somebody does something to search, that can really affect the viability of a business. Okay, thank you.